Hello. Today I will be talking about the failure of the UN to keep peace among the nations and uphold its definition of human rights. In 1990, the UN issued a charter which was formed to save the upcoming generation from the scourge of war. In 2000, this charter was reviewed and the actions of the UN were reviewed in the past decade. The chairman, Lakhdar Brahimi, um, who issued this internal report, stated that the UN had repeatedly failed to meet the challenge it had set out for itself. And the same is actually true today, as I will be arguing. The flaws of the 90s have reveal the UN's systematic flaws even today. I have three examples of ways in which the UN has failed to uphold human rights. In 1996 and 1997, 200,000 refugees were killed in the Congo. These refugees were coming from Rwanda, fleeing from a genocide that had been happening in that country and looking for safety and a new home. Many of these refugees were actually ex-military men, and the Congolese began looking at these refugees as a threat to their sovereignty. So Congolese troops began systematically murdering the Rwandan refugees throughout a number of years. In 1993, the UN entered the Congo in a small group of people sent to investigate whether or not human rights were being violated in this area. The reports came back, and the leader of this operation informed the General Secretary that human rights were indeed being violated and that Rwandan refugees were being systematically registered into the Congolese system so that they could then be eliminated. The Congolese were preparing for a genocide, and the UN decided to ignore this report. They pulled out of the Congo, and 2 or 3 years later, at least 200,000 people were murdered over a series of attacks. The information I got about the Rwandan genocide came from an article written by Al-Hadir Mahiki, and it was published by Cambridge University Press, in case you would like to look it up. Another example is how the UN has failed in Darfur. This information I received from the United Human Rights Organization, and in a UN report, the ongoing genocide of African farmers and others is a situation where people are being murdered at the hands of the Jawanjaweed. This genocide in Darfur has claimed more than 400,000 lives. It reported that hundreds were being killed daily and around 5,000 were dying monthly. In 2012, I read news articles from sources in Sudan reporting the continued violence and the UN's failure to provide adequate help for this area. The UN troops stationed in Darfur have failed to protect those subjected to raid, murder, torture, and plundering. And this is something that has been going on for more than a decade, where UN involvement has not sufficed to meet the great need in these areas and to prevent mass killing of people. A third example comes from the Human Rights Watch, which is an organization based out of the UN, and they were talking about the Central African Republic violence that has been going on, committed by these different military groups on villages in the Central African Republic. There are various villages that have been attacked, and many people have been murdered, women have been raped, children have been enslaved. One example is in the village of Gwen on February 1st and 5th in 2014, which was only last year. So these are very recent events in which the UN has been stationed in these areas, but there have been reports that the troops do not go on regular patrol and have not been providing full assistance to these people who are being attacked. Now, the UN has made claims that these are difficult situations in which they do not know who is initiating the attack, but it is also clear that when women are banging on your walls, the UN compound walls, and not being provided assistance, there is a fundamental flaw in the way the UN is operating and the way they are viewing their duty to protect human rights. These three examples of UN failures failing to uphold their definition of human rights have continued throughout the past couple of decades. The UN not only repeatedly has failed in the 90s, but we can also see through these various massacres of human beings in recent years that the UN has not changed its tactics since the 90s. It is a crime of the UN, but it is also a crime of human beings around the world not to be taking notice of these terrible atrocities against other human beings. We need to make sure that we are aware of what is going on around the world by reading newspapers, reading blogs, and making an effort to figure out what's going on. And we need to be raising our voices in support of helping these people. Whenever the citizens of countries get involved in these issues, that is when changes are made. And if people band together, changes can also be made in the UN. Thank you.